After we last spoke, James, in April 2015?
I think that's right. It's been a while.
Yeah, the world was probably a not completely different place, but it was
definitely
different.
Yeah,
It was
a little different.
But when we spoke to you then, did you have a vision of where you wanted your filmmaking career to go?
I think that if you have an idea of where you need to go, you have to think about how you want to get there. And so it's about steps. And so when I saw you last, I had just done a couple of projects, some of which I was happy with, some of which I wasn't. And so I said, if I'm going to go where I want to be eventually, I've got to be very specific with the choices that I make to get to that point. And that's what I've been doing. I've been very meticulous about the choices I've made and the projects I've selected. The things that I've made, I've ensured that they have the resources requisite to do them. And I've tried to be at that point where I've had enough experience that I know what I'm doing, but if I want to be where I want to end up, I've got to be very specific with those choices I make.
Are you now where you wanted to be?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because when you're working, I think that you assume that the mountain you're climbing is the place you're going to end up, right? If I make it to that point, or if I make that project, that will get me here. But that's actually false, because when you get to the top, when you get to whatever mountain you're trying to climb, doesn't matter what it is, you realize there's a whole mountain chain in front of you, right? And you get there and you're like, oh, there's now this next thing I have to do, and this next thing I have to do. And it goes on and on. And so there really isn't a point in which I think you have arrived in that sense. There's always a new challenge or a new mountain that you have to climb. And so the further you climb, the more you get to do wherever you're trying to get to. You can get closer to that.
Was there anything that happened, and you don't have to give us total specifics or name and names, but where it was like a real eye-opener that you weren't expecting it? It could be positive, negative.
Certainly. Well, when you're directing things, you don't always have control over the outputs. You're responsible for the creative, you're responsible for how it comes out, and if you've done a good or a bad job, or mediocre, whatever it is, that comes out in creative. But when you're done with the film, it's the producers, it's the financiers, they're the people that dictate what happens to that project. And that's something that can be very disheartening to learn if it doesn't go the way you hope it does, even if you've made a good film. And that's something you have to learn to reckon with. That's one lesson that I have learned for sure.
Since our last interview in 2015, it looks like you've turned your attention to narrative shorts and documentaries, features.
I have. Going back to what you were saying, someone asked me this actually yesterday. They're like, so you're doing documentaries now? I was like, no, not at all. I just happen to be doing 2 documentaries right now. I'm in the middle of directing a film about Lucia Lucas, the first transgender opera singer in American history to have a title role in opera. She plays Don Giovanni in Mozart's Don Giovanni at the Tulsa Opera earlier this May. And we got to profile that experience, that entire journey, which was wild. There's a New York Times profile, there's a BBC profile, there's an All Things Considered piece coming out. I mean, it's been a fascinating journey to go through that process and learn about opera, while I've simultaneously been directing a film about American value systems and how they're constructed over the past 2.5, 3 years. That we will finish shooting this July. And both of those films will be out in 2020. So I'm in a really interesting position where those 2 things are happening at the same time. That doesn't mean I'm suddenly doing documentaries. It just happens to be what I'm doing at the moment. I love documentary films, do not get me wrong, but I also love narrative films. And so going back to what I said earlier, you make choices based on what resources you have available. And so there's a couple of featured narrative films that I'm doing that are in different stages of development, but I'm not going to shoot those films until I have the things that I need to get them done. And that's why I've done projects like Angel of Anywhere, which came out last year and did quite well, actually. They're narrative shorts that keep me working in the interim.
Well, you'd done at least one short documentary before on cancer.
Yes.
Right.
I had done a few things about cancer. I also did a film called Digital Edition about the Atlanta Journal-Constitution's transition from print to digital, which I believe I did in 2016. And then I went to go be a filmmaker on Hillary Clinton's campaign in the fall. And so it was a really interesting year. So like I've had a lot of very interesting experiences since we last spoke. But back to what I said, I've been very specific about those choices. And so for me to go between narrative films, documentaries, that's why I want to continue doing, because even some of the filmmakers that I respect the most, like Jotham Demme, Sidney Lumet, the list goes on, they did that throughout their careers, and I would like to emulate that. And so that's what I'm trying to do.
Just on a side note, and maybe you can't answer this, but if you can't, we'll stop.
Of course.
Are you able to tell me just what that was like, working on Hillary's campaign?
Yeah, I can talk about that. Working on the campaign was unlike anything I'd ever done, but it also was an accumulation of all of my experiences in some ways. I was in charge of the state of Virginia, so I did advertising there. Got to work with a variety of influencers like Miley Cyrus, Bellamy Young, Sean Astin, the list goes on and on. There were so many people. And then there were also private citizens and then politicians like Tim Kaine, Madeleine Albright. It was really a wonderful experience to get to work with all of those people and create pieces with them.
So I'm sorry, you were doing sort of directing?
Yeah, I was directing and shooting, and so I was a one-man band in that sense. So I directed, shot, interviewed, packaged, and then worked with Brooklyn to distribute those pieces. So it was really a great experience until the last day.
Yes. So I'm just wondering if you could take me through that. Like, so you have already planned, or someone else has already planned to have those people come to a certain location, or vice versa?
Right. And so the way the campaign worked is that I would be told that, here's a list of people that are coming, or I might find out the day before this person's coming to an event somewhere in the state. I would have to figure out, sort of like you figure out with me, what questions I need to ask them and how I would put them in a context. So, for example, with
Madeleine Albright.
Yeah, Madeleine Albright. So, I was trying to think of what a good thing is. And so Madeleine Albright, obviously, we talked about women's issues and women's rights and things like that. When I had Sean Astin, we took him to this little place that was kind of urban in Richmond. And we just kind of found things and places that would emulate an issue or a topic and then place those subjects in those environments, which was really quite fun because I got to use all of my skills in directing, because I worked with actors, I worked with politicians, I worked with regular old people. So one of the reasons they engaged me for that was that I brought my film experience, but I also brought my documentary experience. And so it really was working with both of those things to create those advertisements for the campaign.
Very cool. That sounds like a really awesome
It was intense. It was very intense and not much sleep, but you don't sleep much in film anyway.
Sure, but I mean, that's really a once in a lifetime.
It was a once in a lifetime opportunity.
The campaign.
And so the reason I wanted to do that was, I personally liked Hillary and I've liked her a long time, but I also thought it was a historic opportunity, once in a lifetime opportunity. I don't see myself doing something like that ever again because I have no desire to suddenly start doing political advertising or, film in politics. I want to keep making narrative films and documentaries. But I thought that was an opportunity that was too interesting to say no to. And that's sometimes what you gotta do. You sometimes say yes and do it. And it's just something I've done now, so.
Last question about this and then I'll wrap up. But when you saw the email or whatever that you could have this opportunity, how long did it take you to make the decision to say yes?
Well, it was a big decision because I had to decide if I wanted to uproot my life for a few months and go to the other side of the country. It's not like just directing a film for a month or two on location. You're embedded for months in a totally different environment. Now, mind you, they provided me with housing and all the stuff that you do. Some people sometimes think I was volunteering on that. No, they were paying me for my services, but they provided all those things. And so it took me a couple of days to decide, but I knew pretty quickly that why would you say no to that? It's such a unique opportunity,
Once your run with the Hillary Clinton campaign was done. How much time went by before you decided you were going to jump into this other
Well, I was pretty depressed. It was for about 6 months, it was pretty personal. And about a month went by, I'm back home here in Los Angeles, and I got an email from a producer that I know, and she said, there's this guy named Guy who lives in Israel, who grew up in the United States, who is interested in making a film about American value systems. And because you had worked on the campaign and because you have a diverse film background, I thought about you immediately and thought that you could be a good fit to chat about his concept for a film. And essentially Guy said that he had been doing a lot of reading about American value systems and how they're created, how our daily choices in life and how they're expressed in elections are directly correlated with the value systems that we identify as being American, which is a really broad topic, right? And so that was the first thing I said. I was like, I agree with you, but I don't know how one makes a 90-minute film about that because it's such a broad topic. And so we started talking and we realized that you could start sorting those into tangible examples through issues like immigration, technology, and isolation, and other things. And then we started figuring out how to make it. And we did our first shoot at the end of 2016, 2 weeks before the inauguration in 2017. And we've been shooting across the country ever since, and we're going to finish shooting it in July and August of this year, 2019, to release it before the election in 2020. It's not a political film, even though politics is an element. It's neither liberal nor conservative, which might be surprising to someone considering I worked on Hillary's campaign. But growing up in a small town in South Georgia, I see the world in this very specific way where I can see how to or at least I can understand how many people come to many different thought processes just from life experience. And so if we pull it off, I think it's going to be a good film to really explain how we as a society create our identity and how that's informed by a long line of history from civilizations that came before America.
Interesting. And are you doing it by like in 10-year increments too, since things have changed?
Well, that's a good question, but it's really about a snapshot of now, and then we're putting that in the context of other civilizations that have risen and fallen effectively, using a myriad of tangential subjects in the Northeast, a bunch of academic and journalistic experts from major organizations across the country, and we'll be putting those things together. And it's not that we're reinventing a wheel here. There's a lot of this information that's out there, but it's in different books or different pieces, and really what we're trying to do is take all of those elements and combine them together into a singular place where you can have a better understanding about how things work.
And I'm sorry, Guy is a...
I'm sorry, I didn't explain.
Oh, no, that's okay.
Guy is a political consultant and academic and entrepreneur. He lives in Israel. He does a mixture of all those things. And so he's worked on campaigns, he's created companies, he's done a lot in a variety of spaces. He's never done a film before. And so that has been an interesting process to go through with a group of people that don't really work in film and kind of bring them into a filmic process and try to take something from academia and put it in something that's digestible for a main audience.
So Guy is in Israel.
He's in Israel,
and
yes.
Do you do like
we
Skype?
We have phone calls, international phone calls at weird hours. He does come to America. He goes back and forth between here and there. When we did our first assembly edit last year with Carlos Puga, who was the producer of True Life on MTV, he's also had several films at Sundance and South by that have won jury awards. He did the edit with us, and we're using that edit to inform what we're about to shoot this summer, so that way we can use that to finish the film. And so Guy has been going back and forth between here and there. So it's always interesting when you're working with people on multiple time zones around the world.
And you say you want to have it as sort of a general statement. You're not for one side or the other.
Certainly. And so, I mean, that's, I think philosophically as a director, it doesn't matter if you're making a narrative film or a documentary. I think that, in fact, doing both makes the other better, in fact, as far as your work goes. But your job is to get inside the mind of a character, right? So if it's a documentary, it's understanding how that person has become the person they are and what that A to B is. When you're directing a narrative film, it's understanding the same psychology of character. And so I find that using those processes and trying to figure out how to make something that is broad-based, it doesn't matter what your personal opinion is about a character or a subject. You have to divorce yourself from that. It matters that you understand how they got there. And that's really, to my mind, one of the first jobs of a director creatively.
What do you do when a film angers you? When you're just totally outraged?
Oh, when you're outraged. When you're outraged with a film. Well, I certainly have strong opinions while I'm watching characters or subjects in a film. I don't like them, right? But it's not my job as a director to make a judgment call about a character, I think. I think it's my job to express them as they are fairly. And so if I don't agree with a character, I don't like a character, right? I have to figure out how to let the audience understand how that person got to that point, or that character, whatever it is. I have to provide them with the psychosis so they can make that decision for themselves. I might be trying to project something. Obviously, every director is trying to project something with a film, right? But I think my job is more about creating an overall pashmina, this kind of bigger fabric, a theme. And within that theme, how do those characters tie into that? And that is my job, to make sure the theme is coming together as expressed through those characters, as long as I'm being fair with the characters, so that way you as an audience member can make a decision whether or not to like that person or not.
What if you're not the director for the film, you're an audience member, whether
Sure.
it's narrative, documentary, and it just totally angers you?
There aren't many films I get really angry with, but when I do get angry with it, I think that there's nothing wrong with being angry at a character or being angry with a film or a subject about anything, really. I think that a more passionate response probably means that you made a more interesting film. I think there's nothing wrong with passion. For example, Mother last year, I think it was last year, or the year before, one of the two. But when Mother came out, I personally loved it. I laughed my head off the whole time. I thought it was the funniest film I had seen that year. But no one else in the theater felt that way. I was the only one. People were leaving, walking out, and even saying that film out loud on this will elicit so many YouTube comments that I'm reading that is going to spark debate. And I think that is indicative of an interesting film. You can decide if it's good or bad, but I think that if it's something that lingers with you, if you get angry, if it sparks a reaction, that means you've done something interesting.
How has your preparation evolved?
I think in some ways my preparation has evolved in the sense that I want to have a stronger idea of what I think the overarching theme is going to be. I think sometimes when we're prepping for films, especially when you're first starting out, you're really engaged in plot and character, and you should be. I'm not saying don't be engaged in plot or character, but I think in some ways you need to be more engaged in theme, because the more you understand what the big themes are, the better you're able to work with character and plot to make those themes extrapolate. And it's everything from production design to cinematography to editing choices, color, everything across the board informs theme. And so if you can walk into a film and say, this is the palette that I want to paint, then all those other things, if you've done all the prep work right, if you have a good script, if you have a good story, whatever it may be, you'll find that they come into focus much quicker.
James, the town you grew up in has like what?
123 people.
Okay.
I flip the sign every time I go back, yes.
So when you come and go, do you cross off the 3? Oh,
yeah,
okay.
I tell that, man, it's a joke. It's a bad joke. Anyway.
So you said off camera that you've been back and forth several times. When you go back, do you have sort of this broader view of like, this is the town I grew up in, I remember the stories that I wanted to tell, and now I have the chance to do that? Or is it...
Of course, no. I think about that constantly, actually. I mean, I'm very lucky. There are many filmmakers that are way more talented than me that are not nearly as lucky as I have been. I go home and I love going home. It's so much different environmentally than it is being in Los Angeles or even shooting somewhere around the world. You know, coming home is home, no matter where you're from. And when I go there, I kind of look around. I see people that I grew up with. I see, you know, people that have been big influences in my life, people that have died. And I think about the life that I could have had versus the life I have now. And that's not to say that life would have been bad. I want to be clear, it would have been different. But it still would have been a good life living in Bellville or anywhere in that region. There are many wonderful people that live there. But I've been really lucky to work with some of the top talent in the world and to do it all over the world. And not many kids from Bellville, Georgia, or towns that small get that opportunity. And I think for me, having that perspective every time I go home, it just reminds me how lucky I've been, and I'm really grateful.
Do you think it's all luck, though? Because it sounds like you plan things
well,
and you...
For sure. I mean, not everything's luck. I think that it does require planning and methodology, but as someone told me not long ago, you can be making the best music in your living room, and if nobody hears that music, it doesn't matter, right? So there is a bit of luck. You have to meet the right people, you have to be in the right places, and it's true that talent is not the only thing that makes a career successful. As I said, there are many talented filmmakers I know that have not been as lucky as I have been, or that don't work in film anymore because they weren't very lucky. I just happened to meet some of the right people at the right time in my career who have been very helpful to me. Because I was in the room at the right time. There is an element of luck, and I think the discount that is not truthful. You've really got to have a mixture of talent and stamina and vision, but also a little bit of luck. Because if you're doing that work in your living room and nobody knows, or editing that film and nobody sees it, who cares?
Any tips to filmmakers on how to get luckier?
Yeah, how do you get luckier? Go to every film festival and meet everybody that's there that you get into. I think that I, in particular, figured out at a very early age, and I'm glad I learned that lesson, that I needed to start going to film festivals and then networking at those festivals, not making an idiot of myself, hopefully making a good impression. And the thing that's remarkable now that I'm almost 31, I've been doing this since I was 19, 18. And so there are festivals in this country that I have been going to since I was 19. And I still go to those festivals. In fact, one in Georgia, the Macon Film Festival, that was the first festival to program my work. One of the coolest things happened over the past few years. I directed a film called Angel of Anywhere. That's a film about an empathetic stripper who plays therapist at his bar. It's a drama at a strip club. And we won Best Narrative Short there. I had never won an award at the Macon Film Festival since 19 years old. Never, not once. Not an audience award, nothing. But they had programmed every film of mine since then. And so it was I teared up, I still do a little bit. It was kind of emotional for me because it doesn't seem like it's a big thing. But when you have that kind of a relationship, that history, you kind of look back on your work and you can see that arc. And it's just been remarkable to go to festivals like Macon and others across the country, not just there. and see the same audience come back every year because you're there for the film, because it's your film, because they know you and they know your work. And over time, that's what builds an audience, because you're building your little tribes all over the country. And it's kind of neat to look back on that. It really is. And even 10 years from now, what that will look like, you know? I am very cognizant of how lucky I've been in my career. I think for me, it's felt more acutely because of where I grew up, because I grew up in this tiny small town, South Georgia. I feel that. I feel that. There are many talented filmmakers out there that have not been as lucky as I have been. And then there are many that have been much luckier than I have been too. So, you know, I certainly do not see myself in that way. But I think people forget that progress and that journey you have to go on. There are a lot of people that say they want to do film, but they don't really know what that looks like. It's long, hard days, long, hard hours. The part that's glamorous, that people perceive to be glamorous, is such a tip of the iceberg thing that it's not really why you should do it. If that's what you think it is, you shouldn't be doing film. It is 18, 20-hour days sometimes. It is days like I'm in now, because I am having to direct 2 films at the same time and throw an ad campaign in the middle of it. I am working from, I don't believe in mornings as a rule unless I'm filming, but I am working from like 10 in the morning to sometimes 3 or 4 at night on an edit, on a film with my team, to get it done on time, because I have another film that I'm directing, because I have another ad campaign I'm directing, because I'm having to figure out how to have my schedule in Los Angeles mesh with going to Singapore and being in the Northeast and being in Israel, and then manage those things all at the same time. All at the same time. That's not glamorous. That's hard damn work. And if you aren't ready to do things like that. And I understand that I'm lucky, and that is not common. Even in my own life, that is not common. This is an unusual time. But if you aren't prepared for that to be a possibility, when you cross that bridge, and hopefully you will, you got to be ready for it. And to do that, it takes a lot of sacrifice. And yeah, I'm young. I mean, I'm only 31 now. I'm 31 in a month. But I've been doing this for like almost 15 years. It's a long time. And I certainly haven't been at a place where I would say I've made it. But I think that if I've been able to do this nonstop as my only job for 15 years, pretty damn lucky.
It's interesting when someone is young, how maybe there are more detractors in that sense, just because people think, well, that's not fair. But you're not taking someone else's chance.
Sure. But I knew what I wanted to do early on, and then I did it. And then I was lucky enough to meet the right people and go to the right places to build a network that enabled me to do it. Because I've never had a full-time job in my life. I've never worked at a Starbucks. I've never driven an Uber so far. I've been very lucky that this is all I do. If I'm not directing a film or a documentary, I'm directing an ad or a music video, or some company wants me to do a corporate piece or whatever it is. I've been lucky, and I've figured out how to make that work. But I also knew what I wanted to do, and I did it. And so I think that if you want to do it, or if you're like, well, how do you get to that point? You got to be ready to put in the hours.
Can you take us through the process of narrative film versus documentary? What are the differences in shooting feature films of either of those two?
Well, the differences between doing a documentary or narrative, in the sense that you have to tell a story, isn't any different, right? The difference is that in a documentary, you have a concept, right? It's like, here's a 1-sentence logline about the film that I think I'm going to make. Usually, by the end of that filming period, the film you thought you were making is usually much different than the film you made. I also find that can sometimes be the same in narrative films because you go in with one idea about here's what's on the page, but when you bring in performers who have their own ideas and thoughts, I believe, again, philosophically as a director, if you're going to engage actors or a DP or anyone, you really should permit them to use the skills that they're trained in. And so they're going to have ideas and thoughts that will change the general idea and trajectory of the film. But those are similarities. The difference is, in a documentary, is that you've got to assemble the story as you're going. And so it's not that I'm working from a script and saying, oh, what do I need to cut out? Or we're running out of time, or do we need to rework this? Maybe the dialogue isn't working. In a documentary, it's being cognizant of tracking your story as you're shooting it to say, this is the log line I started with, and now it's tracking towards something different. If that difference is a better film, how do I get from here to here? Because you're doing it in real time. And so if you're successful and you come out on the other end with a good film because you've tracked it and you've figured it out, I think it makes your narrative storytelling much better because A, you have a better idea of human behavior and how people do things, how things are constructed, but B, you go through this deconstruction of story in real time that you don't have to go through when you're shooting a narrative film. That's something that you would typically do in script development, right? But it enables you to do that development much better because then you can poke holes in the structure of story that I think that might be a little harder if you didn't have documentary experience.
Yeah, having spoken with a few documentary filmmakers on how they go in to shoot one story and then
it's different.
Drastically some major things happen, and then they're like, okay, do we make the same film?
Right.
Do we stop? And
I think it's wiser to follow the story where it goes. Sometimes, it goes in unexpected directions. Even the film I just directed about Lucia Lucas, the opera singer in Tulsa, Oklahoma at the Tulsa Opera, I walked in with one logline that she's the first transgender opera singer in American history to have a leading role. But as I'm shooting, it was very apparent to me, even walking into it, that you can't make that be your film. That's the reason you're there, but that's not necessarily the film. Those are two very different things. And so as I'm shooting, I had to follow the story and open up to other characters and figure out how they all interact together, what pieces of a puzzle you need to kind of create a total picture of how an opera is put together, how it's performed and delivered on the backdrop of an international news story that's also in Tulsa, Oklahoma, a very unlikely place. So you're triangulating, in that sense, all of these different elements to create the narrative. And so if you do your job right, I think as a documentarian, your job is to apply those narrative film skills to your documentary. But as a documentary filmmaker, you're nimble enough to follow that story wherever it goes.
Were you thinking of how to approach it during the flight to Tulsa, or once you got there and entered the world?
Oh, no. Well, I had lots of conversations before I got there. That film came together very quickly. The producers emailed me about a month before it was supposed to be filmed, and they said, here's the log line, are you interested? And I was fascinated immediately, and I called them and I said, I know nothing about opera. I've never been to an opera in my life, so I love this story. I think it's could be interesting, but I don't know if I should do this. And they said, we actually think because you've never been to an opera and because you know nothing about opera, that you actually might be the perfect person because you'd look at it in a different way. And so once they gave me permission to be okay with that, I started thinking more about what I thought the story should be. And, I had Skype calls with Lucia, who lives in Germany, and then, a couple of those in advance to try to get a better sense of who she was, what makes her tick, things like that. And then as I'm getting to Tulsa and as I have this kind of base of knowledge, that was structured in a way where they're, doing an opera in 30 days, right? So it's a very, straightforward structure. It's going from point A to point B. So I'm not having to invent that, right? It's a kind of behind the scenes film in that sense. But as you're filming, you realize that there are elements that you need to include that you wouldn't have necessarily picked up just from Lucia or just from the opera itself. Things about the town, things about the opera company, things about the nature of being a performer. These are all things that you kind of have to follow as you're filming, to be cognizant of, to be aware of, so you know what the best version of the film is that you're capable of making.
And there are opera groupies.
Yeah.
And they run the gamut of ages.
Great.
It's
really
fascinating.
I mean, learning about opera, I mean, I'll go to the opera now. It was really a fascinating experience. And I still don't fully I understand mechanically what it means to project and sing. I don't know how they do it. I mean, watching them, if you ever get the opportunity to make a film with professional musicians from all over the world, do that film. It's a great experience. The director of the show is from the Royal Opera in London. The artistic director is Tobias Picker, one of the most prolific living opera composers today. He did an adaptation of Roald Dahl's Fantastic Mr. Fox. He's doing an adaptation of The Danish Girl. The conductor's from Uruguay. Lucia's from Germany. I mean, it was a cast of people from all over the world with different sensibilities, but all of them with world-class, literally, talent. They're some of the top people in that profession, and it was really cool. It's really, really cool.
One of the things they always talk about in film or with acting, whatever, is just kind of like when it rains, it pours, and when it dries up, it dries up. So it sounds like you've had a quite rainy season in terms of
I've had a very
lot of work.
Rainy season, which is great.
How are you balancing it?
Droughts aren't fun, and so I much prefer rainy season. I would prefer it to be a little more sprinkly than thunderstorm season, but it's been great. I'm in the middle of directing The American Question, my documentary about American value systems, and we had planned to finish shooting that this spring summer, because we think it needs to be out before the 2020 election, just for marketing reasons, for personal reasons, a lot of reasons. And when I was getting ready to do that shoot, I got a phone call from the producers of the Lucia Lucas film, and they asked me if I wanted to come to Oklahoma for a month in April. This is somewhere around first or second week of March. And so once they decide that they want me to direct this film, I had to totally reconfigure my schedule for the summer to prep for that film in March, to go to Oklahoma in April, come back here to LA in May for the first assembly edit. I have an ad campaign in Singapore next month that I have to go do, and I'm coming back to finish shooting The American Question in July, which will be in the Northeast and in Israel, while also running post-production on Lucia's film, because both of those films have to be delivered for a 2020 release. And so it's a lot of juggling and time management. And mind you, even in March, when I'm having negotiations on Lucia's project, I was working on 3 other films at the same time that were nothing to do with those 2 other projects. And so I'm having to get those things done while I'm also doing negotiations, planning, and realigning the other film. This is not typical. This is not my daily life. It's the first time I've dealt with having to do 2 films at once. It's a wonderful problem to have. I'm glad I have this problem because I've been in that drought before. No good. But you just have to really understand how to manage your time and make sure everyone you're working with feels like they are getting adequate attention. The second that they don't feel that, the more complicated your life becomes.
In what way?
In the way that they don't think that you can do it. I mean, it's really about confidence. They have to understand that you are focused on the project you have been engaged for. And so even if I am working on 3 or 4 things at the same time, even now I'm working on 2 or 3 feature narrative films that 1 or 2 of which are getting quite close. Probably 1 will shoot next year. I still have to make sure things are happening on that. And so it's making sure that everything has the resources they need to get going what needs to get done, right? And also making sure that the people working on them know that you're focused on it. They don't necessarily have to know that you're working on those 5 other things. They just need to know they're working on theirs, you know.
Any tips on how to balance your time? Because it is interesting how you could go through a drought with whatever, and then all of a sudden all these great things will happen at once. And in some ways it's like, no, I wanted to spread it out and enjoy this and this and this, but I can't totally enjoy it.
Yeah. I think that especially when I'm in an interesting place in my career, because I'm neither made it, I guess, but I'm not starting out. I'm in that weird middle space where I have lots of work. I live comfortably. I've done a lot of the hard work to get where I'm at, but I haven't done, you know, the Avengers 20. And so I think that when you're in that space, you don't have the luxury of saying no because you're trying to get to that other space. Not that I want to do the Avengers 20, but if I do, great. But you've got to say yes to the things that you know you can do well, to the things that you know are going to help you, to the projects that make sense to you creatively. If you can juggle and you can do all of those things effectively and do good work, that only helps you ascend the broader mountain chain you're trying to climb. And it also gives you better skill sets, because when you can manage lots of different moving pieces, the bigger your films become, the higher your budgets get, the more adept you are at being able to do that.
Was it Shonda Rhimes who talked about saying yes to everything for a year? Maybe I'm getting it mixed
Shonda,
up.
yeah, she said it was the year of yes. And then Shonda also has this you know, crazy schedule with how she, you know, delivers edits on multiple television shows and the way that she works. I've read a good bit about it. I don't know her personally. And I think that, you know, that there's a way to do that. She's right. Like, you have to say yes to all of these things, but then you also have to learn to manage and what makes sense for you, what makes sense for your personal life, making sure that you have what you need. Because if you're not satisfied creatively, or if you don't have, you know, if you're so exhausted that you can't manage it, it's probably not going to be good work. And so you've got to find a balance. But as long as you can balance all of those things, or if you have the power, like I fortunately did, to kind of have some say over your schedule, you can make things work. And so we'll see how it comes out. You guys can find out when a few months.
To be continued.
Yes, TBD.
That's an interesting problem to be sitting with, is being in the middle there, and knowing that you have to say yes because it's not, maybe you feel like it's not time to turn stuff down.
Right.
You're not at the point where, like, okay, tell so-and-so, you know, you've got this assistant you've got 20 people coming in, handlers, all this stuff. But at the same time, you're not starting out. So I was wondering, did you ever envision being in this place where you're wrestling with that dilemma?
No, you don't. I don't think you ever envision that space. It's a space that I think is something that happens with time, right? It's one of those things when you're first starting out, you're like, if I can just get that first feature done, everything's fine. But that's not true, right? It's then about proving that you're not a one-trick pony. And so it's that middle space that maybe is the most critical, because then you have to show a couple of things. One, you have to show you've got it. You've got the stamina to keep going, that you're dedicated, that you're committed, that this is what you're going to do. But then you have to put out good work. And so as long as you're doing consistent, good work in that middle space, I believe that is what helps you to get to that next space. But it really is about saying yes to the things that make sense. It's not saying yes to everything. Let's be very clear. There are things I turn down all the time. But if it's something that makes sense to me creatively, if it has a budget on which I know I can make a good film, if it has the right talent involved, it has people that I want to work with, then I'll do it. I will figure out how to do it. But I mean, I say no to things that if I don't care for some of the entities involved, or if I think there's no way to make it on the budget that they want to do it on, I'll say no to that, because that's not helpful. And so I think that if you're looking at your career in this broader way, you have to say yes to those things that make sense, say no to the things that don't.
Yeah, that is another interesting thing in that taking a job that could actually hurt you down the line because maybe you did everything you were supposed to, but for whatever reason, that other party
It's
got
like
playing by different rules.
they're playing by different rules, or they don't know what they're doing, or you just don't like the way they work, or maybe you have opposite processes of working, which is okay. It's all right if there is no one way to do a film or to have a creative process. I think that sometimes people, and especially in interviews like this, perceive that, you know, somebody like me is saying this is the only way to do this thing. That's not true.
Right.
That's false. I read the YouTube comments. That's false. I don't think that.
You're not the only one to get those comments.
There is no one way. There is no one way to do something. There's the way that I know how to do it.
Sure.
And so, you know, even expressing how I do it is how I do it. And so then it's finding other people who share congruent or similar processes to collaborate with. And then you tend to have a more fluid process. But if you find that there's someone that has something that is so opposite, or that person's so odious or toxic, or, you know, whatever it may be, I can now at this point have the luxury of choosing to say no, which is something I may not have had 6-8 years ago, you know? Now I have that luxury. And so that's the weird middle, right? You have enough experience where people come to you with projects and say, here it is, here's the budget, great, you go do it. But that doesn't mean you always want to say yes.
And it's about self-preservation too, because
course.
if you say yes to someone that you're not on the same page, and then there's a fiasco for whatever reason.
You have no control over it. And then it's the longevity thing, because if something is a fiasco in the middle, this middle space, I don't think you can afford to have many fiascos. You might be able to afford to have one. I don't know if you can afford many. You have to have as many things as close to perfect or as best you can make it as possible. I think that formative. I think it's that formative. That's the space, because then if you make one good film and then you make 2 or 3 bad ones, then one trick pony. If you make 1 or 2 good ones, 3 good ones, one's off, you're like, oh, it's an off day. But you can't afford to make bad work. You've got to make sure that you're making the best work that you can make if you want to continue proceeding, especially in that middle ground.
What are the biggest mistakes you've made on the first day of shooting?
I think some of the biggest mistakes I've made on the first day of shooting usually pertain to interpersonal things. At this point, I kind of know what I need to do to get something done technically. I know the story. I know all of the different pieces that I need to deploy to hopefully have a good film. And the first day obviously sets the tone for many of those things, right? You have sometimes people you've worked with hundreds of times, and then sometimes you've got people that are brand new that you've never seen before. And so when you're doing that, I think you have to figure out how those relationships that you have existing are going to mesh with those that are new. And so it's figuring out the interpersonal dynamics of how these people tick, what makes them tick, deciding what they think is funny or not funny. Things like that, because that tone you set on your set on the first day, it does not matter what the film is, it can be anything you're shooting, an ad, a documentary, film, whatever, that is going to set the tone with that person that doesn't know you for the rest of the shoot. And if you blow that, and I have before, by misjudging someone and kind of what they, you know, how they feel about things, whatever it may be, it's then got to be work on you to get that back, to get them back. And so I think that may be, for me personally, the most, that's something I messed up before. And I try to do better about now.
Well, and that's big of you to admit that you misjudge, but there are also people that look for challenge. And they see someone in charge or whatever, and whatever they're dealing with, and they're like, no, I'm going to be the thorn in the side for this one.
Sure,
and,
and some people definitely have that. I try to meet as many people as possible across as many departments as possible before shooting something to kind of get a sense of people and how they are. And if there's someone that I think is so egregious, I'll talk to a department head and say, let's cut this person. I've done it.
Sure.
And so, you know, that tone and climate in a set to me is very important. It starts at the top. It starts with me. If you set a good tone, if you set a good atmosphere for your cast, for your crew, typically, even if you are working on a lower budget or if someone's not being paid as well, whatever it is, they will work better because they like the space they're in. And so it is on me as director to set that tone. If I'm heinous or if I come in with a bad attitude, that trickles down very fast. And so it's really my job to figure out what makes my crew and my cast tick. And once I understand the dynamics of that, then I have a lot more latitude to do the things as I want.
I don't know if I would really see you being the one. I'll just say that, but I'm sure that there are.
I'm sure there are people that have worked with me that don't like me. It happens. Everyone has.
But sometimes people don't like someone for something that's not the person's fault.
That's true.
So and I'll be the one to say that. So if you can sense someone is trying to whatever, they want to be the director and they are kind of like coming from the side and doing things, what's the best way to diffuse some of that? Without having to call a department head and send them home. Are there ways with humor, maybe not humor, to get them to respect you?
Well, I try to figure out what, again, makes that person tick. And sometimes it's just identifying little things like they need this thing in craft services, right? It's sometimes figuring out that they love this type of coffee and having a PA go get it for them, whatever it may be. It's sometimes just little things. It's observations, right? So even a little observation like that can go a long way to make someone feel wanted and needed on a set, because I think that when people want to take charge, it's not usually because they're a dominating bully on the set. It can be. Usually it's because they think you're not competent. I think that usually that's the reason that people try to do that. And so if you display competency, if you're calm, if you know what you want to do, this may be shocking to you, but I'm usually not hot-headed. And so I keep a very even tone, even with myself. Even if I'm not in a good mood or if I'm tired or whatever it is, I try not to project that onto the set because I know that will then trickle down. So I try to find the things that that person needs to feel comfortable on set, even if it's a creature comfort like a coffee or a crafty thing. But then it's also just making sure that they understand that I understand what I'm doing. I've been very lucky that I haven't had that happen recently, but earlier in my career, for sure, I definitely had to deal with that. With actors and people working on the film, for sure. And I've learned from those lessons and know that I have to make sure my shit's together before I can tell all these people what to do and how to do.
What's the hardest thing to film in terms of logistics?
The hardest thing to film logistically is anytime you are taking a crew from one place to another place on a plane, and you're figuring out all of the equipment that needs to come with you, that has to be shipped, that has to be flown, and where that's going to end up and who on local crew is going to receive it, where it's going to be, and how you're meshing that stuff with stuff from local houses. I've dealt this on multiple films. I did it when I did my film in India. I did it from the film I just did in Oklahoma, and I will do it again this summer in the film in Israel. That is a lot of logistics. I find that if you do your planning right, you know, your schedule comes into place, your team comes into place, that's all fine. But the logistics of getting things from one place to another and then dealing with what happens if something goes wrong from something that, say, I have in Oklahoma that has to go back to Los Angeles, then you have to deal with that. For example, when we were shooting Lucia Lucas' film in April of this year, we had a ready rig that was broken in flight from Los Angeles to Oklahoma, and the local house in Oklahoma City that's an hour and a half away did not have it. So we had to ship it back to LA, and then they had to ship us back another piece to make sure we could do steady cam work on the film. Now that doesn't sound like it's a big deal, and at the end of the day it's really not. But I have to then deal with what happens now that that piece of equipment is missing for these 2 days. How do we shoot this scene in a documentary that I will never have the opportunity to shoot again and still get what I plan to do when me and the DP were shortlisting? And so there are plenty of examples of things like that happen. Even when I was shooting Desires of the Heart in India, the equipment came from Mumbai to Bikaner on a train, a 3-day train ride across India. We were lucky that nothing broke, but if something had broken, I'm not exactly sure what we would have done in the desert next to the Pakistan border. I don't know what we would have done. And so depending on where you're shooting, like in Oklahoma, I can have something swapped out. But if I'm in India on the desert, you might be shit out of luck. So you got to figure out how to adjust your plans to make sure everything keeps moving.
Should a good film leave unanswered questions?
Oh, I think so. I don't think a film has to answer every single question. In our previous interview, I believe we talked about this, in fact, that I think that every film is a kind of a question mark if you do it right, and I still believe that. I think that most good films leave you something to think about. I'm not saying that means you need to be sloppy or lazy or not have a good plot or direct and do your job properly, but you need to, I think, to make a great film, to leave something that has the audience left to wonder, to ask a question about. When we did Angel of Anywhere, I specifically, where I was working with the writers on the script, when we came up with the concept, that I wanted it to have an intentional vagueness to its ending that left the audience with a question instead of a period. I think in my own personal taste, that is what makes a better film, because then I don't walk out and say, oh, everything was resolved, that was lovely. It gives me something to think about long after I've watched it, and the films that I've most enjoyed do that. And so I try to emulate that in my own work.
Any recent films that have left with you with a question mark? Any recent
films that left me with a question mark? A Star is Born was an interesting film, I thought, that left some very interesting questions. Now, I did not love the film. Yeah. I liked half of the film. I thought it was half of a good film. I thought the other half of it was... I thought the second half of A Star is Born, the script wasn't very well constructed. But I thought that it did leave some interesting character stuff with you. In fact, I think the character stuff in that film is far more interesting than the plot itself, because Bradley Cooper and Lady Gaga and Sam Elliott for that matter, all give terrific career-defining performances, in my opinion, which is a weird thing to say that I didn't love the film, but I loved the characters inside of it, because the way that they constructed character, and remarkably for a first-time director, Bradley Cooper is amazing. Amazing! I can't wait to see what he does again, truly. Those characters left me with questions because they're all ambiguous. There's nothing about those characters that are defined in this kind of specific way. It is always asking you a question about who they are, what their motivations are, what their purposes are. The three principles, not some of the secondary ones. But Lady Gaga, Bradley Cooper, and Sam Elliott always leave you with something to ask a question about where they come from, what their motivation is. There's a certain dynamic about what it means to be an artist, and that I think that's very honest. And those characters leave you with that question. And so sometimes it doesn't even have to be plot, because I think the plot itself isn't very good, but the characters are fantastic.
Andrew Dice Clay, too. It was great when she came back.
Fabulous.
And that was kind of her little, I guess working class world that she lived in, and sort of the safety of her dad and all these guys,
Exactly.
Hanging around
and it's this world that, they create. And look, I don't like to badmouth people's films. I'm really not trying to, because I know how hard it is to make a film. But I think that even if it's a film that I didn't like in its totality, like A Star is Born, I understand how well directed that film was watching it. I also understand how well acted it was. And so I think think that with many films, even the ones that you don't necessarily like in their entirety, that doesn't make it a good or bad film. I think that's the Rotten Tomatoes-ization of how we look at films, right? It's 70% good or 30% bad. That's false. That's a falsehood. And that's not even how that thing works. It's an aggregate percentage of positive or negative reviews. It means nothing about it's 70% good or bad. I think there are things that we pull from all films, even ones that we like in some ways and not in others. So it's a good example of that, I think.
Did you see 8th Grade?
I loved 8th Grade.
I loved it too. Do you know someone got out of the theater, left, they were just, I won't say which scene it was. Yeah. It wasn't the totally PC scene, and they had just had it, and they made this big production.
I
and
thought
I was
it
like,
was
He's
a wonderful
right
film. 8th Grade was also what. Now, 8th Grade I think had one of the best screenplays of the year. That was such a sharply written script, and Elsie Fisher's a revelation. I mean, it really was a wonderful, wonderful film. Yeah.
What are your 5 best filmmaking rules?
Oh yes, this is one YouTube loved last time. Let me think.
Maybe they've changed.
They might have changed a little bit. So last time we spoke, I know I gave you 5 filmmaking rules, and I really enjoyed reading your comments on that. The things I think that have changed and evolved for me in some ways have a lot to do with preparation process more than being on set. I think for me, the first question is this a plot that I respond to? And in that plot, is there a theme that I think I can weave in that's going to help that plot out? If I can answer yes to that, then I will do the film or think about doing the film, right? So then the second question becomes, what's the budget for this film? Is this realistic? Is this a budget that we can execute? Does it make sense that I say yes to it? If the answer is, I love this script, I love this story, I love this documentary concept, whatever it is, but I know that I can't film it on the resources they have available, I will ask if they have the opportunity to have this much more before we start filming, before I say yes or no. If they come back with yes and it ends up working, I'll do it. If they say no, I'll walk away. Because at this point in my career, I'm not going to choose to do something that I know I can't pull off, because that's not good for me. The third thing I want to know is, what kind of autonomy do I have or don't have on working on a film? Because even though you're directing a film, that doesn't mean that you have, especially at this point in your career, full autonomy on the creative product. Do you have Final Cut? Are you sharing Final Cut? Do you have a producer that wants to run off with it and do their own thing? These are all questions I want to know the answer to, and will be in my legal work before I sign to say yes to do anything. Because if it's something where the producers want me to come in, direct the film, and leave, I'm not going to do it. I want to be there from start to finish, because at the end of the day, my name will be on there as a director. And if I did not truly direct the totality of the film, then I'm not doing it. Because there are 3 films you make: the one that you conceptualize, the one you shoot, and the one you edit. And if I'm not part of all 3 of those films, it's not mine. I'll say no if that happens. So the fourth piece of that is, when I've said yes to something, it's about making sure that the right people are in the right positions, that I have the right DP, the right editor, production designer, costume designer, etc. goes down the line. I want to make sure that I have a mixture of people that I've worked with before, that I need our working relationship with in specific roles dependent on the content. And I also need to bring in new blood, to bring in fresh ideas in other ways. So for example, I think a good place you sometimes do that is in production design. My DP and I have worked together for years, and so we have this shorthand that's very beneficial, but a different production designer on a film might give a different look to a film that you might need on a specific film, right? And so it's really about identifying who are my trusted collaborators that I always am bringing back for specific things, and what's different about this specific project that I need new ideas for. Because if I'm hiring these people to do their jobs, it's about me communicating the overarching theme and the vision I have for the film. But then it's making sure that I've empowered them to do that job and not micromanage them and say, oh, well, this is how this, and this should be. I've hired a professional for a reason. And so it's then my job to find the right professional. Final thing is that before we've ever started filming, I want to make sure that all of my ducks are in a row. I want to make sure all of the legal work is done with our actors. If we're dealing with SAG, making sure escrow is clear. This is not glamorous stuff, by the way. That has nothing to do with me as a director. This is more producer stuff, right? But I think as a director, it's important for me to be cognizant of it. I need to know, for example, how many hours have these actors or union crew, whatever it is, how much are they working? What is their day? Are they working an 8-hour day or a 12-hour day? Because when I choose to go over, if I choose to call grace, whatever it is, what are the repercussions of the decisions that I make? Because the second that I call overtime, I have now triggered all of these new rules for multiple unions that my producers and financiers now have to deal with because I made that choice. If I am not cognizant of what those parameters are, if I don't have a schedule that can fit within what those parameters are, I need to adjust it because I have to be respectful to all of those entities involved. I need to ensure that my crew has rest, my cast has rest. I need to make sure that the budget that I agreed to on step 2, I can actually execute. Because if I go overtime, I've then cut into the wiggle room that I might have had otherwise. So that's how I try to think about it now.
Well, we talked earlier about this middle area, and we've talked about some of the comments. And yeah, there's different reasons why people leave different comments, and most of it has to do with them.
Yeah, no, I'm fine.
But let me just play the devil's advocate here, because I can say, oh, this guy's good looking, he's young, but do you want to share how much time maybe that you've taken from your own personal life to do all this and to not have a personal life and not be able to do some of the fun things like hang out or whatever? Yes, film festivals are great, but in the sense that's work.
It's work. I think that people forget sometimes. I'm partially kidding about YouTube comments. I love you all. But the, everybody has a different way of doing something, and that's okay. But everyone that works in film, we all have to spend a lot of time away from our significant others, from our friends, from our family, to really do the things that we want to do. It's in some ways the first priority in your life, and that's not to discount your relationships and such. But when you work for someone, if you have a regular job, right? Like I go to work at a CPA office every day. You have someone that has created a safety net for you. You're going to get this much money every month. You're going to have a health insurance plan. You're going to have all these things. When you're in film, unless you have gotten to a point where you've joined the DGA or the Actors Guild, whatever it is, you are your safety net. You are your own brand. And that means that you have to provide for all of those things that someone else might help provide for you. And so it is a sacrifice that you have to figure out to say, what is the balance between my professional life and my personal life? Past few months in particular have been rough because I've been traveling all over the place and on very tight deadlines. I know my husband would like to see more of me, but he doesn't. So, that is what it is, but he understands and he knows that. He knows that I have to do these things to get from point A to point B, and he can see the trajectory of where I have evolved over the years. So I think that, as long as your significant other or your family or friends, whoever, understands that and can see progress, they can put up with that because they know where you're going. But you do have to deal with a great bit of that sacrifice and time commitment, because if you're not invested, you're not going to get there. You just won't. You won't see that evolution from point A to point B because you're not putting in the time or the effort to get there.
James, what would you say to that person that just can't get that first project off the ground?
Well, no one's asking for your film. Let's start there. No one cares about you. No one wants to hear your film. No one wants to hear your story because they don't know you exist. I don't mean that in a harsh way, but they don't care about your film. And so if you want your first film to be made, unless you're independently wealthy, which I was not independently wealthy, being the child of teachers, I had to figure out how to do it. I had to figure out how to put money together. My first film was a short film called The Car Wash with a dear friend of mine named Edith Ivey, who is still with us. She's almost 91 now. And she agreed to be in my film because she liked my script. And I figured out how to finance it by making high school graduation DVDs with a camcorder, having a basic package for $20 where you would get just your college graduation on a DVD, but for $30 you could get an upgraded package with an exclusive behind-the-scenes photo gallery before graduation and your name printed on a disc. 80% of the people bought the deluxe edition, even though there's not really a big difference between the two. But then I was able to use that money to channel it into making my first film. I was able to fly Edith to Savannah to Statesboro. I was able to pay for a hotel, do catering, all of these things. I was still in college, and I didn't have money, but I made enough money to pay her SAG student fee. I made enough money to do all those other things. And it was because I looked at things entrepreneurially and I said, how can I do this one thing to do this other thing? Because nobody cared about my film. Nobody cared about me. It's like, oh, you're not, I've never made anything. Who cares? You're in college, whatever. I made it happen for myself. And because I made that choice and because I cast the right actor, because I took it to film festivals, because I went to those film festivals all on my own dime, not because I'm independently wealthy, again, I was able to get to a point where now people give me checks to make films. And it was because I took that initiative. So it's not that you can't make your film, it's you're choosing not to make it because you're choosing not to take that leap. There is no guarantee when you take that leap that you will have that wonderful series of events happen. None. I was just lucky that people liked the film that I made. And so the best thing you can do is write the best damn script you can make, get the best feedback you can from people you know, from people that happen to work in the industry. If there's an online script service that can review your script, whatever it is, take the notes, take the feedback, don't reject it, embrace those things because you probably don't know what you're doing yet because you haven't done it, and then make it the best film you can make. And then take it to festivals, put it on the internet, do whatever you have to do, and then do it again. And it's gonna still take you a while before people give you a check to make a film, unless you suddenly get 20 million hits on your film on YouTube, or if it wins the jury prize at Sundance, right? It's very unlikely that you're suddenly going to start getting checks. And so you have to keep doing what I did, which is do something else, use that money to make something. And over time, I started shifting from having to spend my own money to spending other people's. But with that comes an entirely different set of challenges entirely.
But you keep saying lucky. Can I just interject? You also sound very organized and very disciplined.
Well, you have to be, but that's not a skill that you're born with, I don't think. That's a skill that you learn. But I mean, I do sincerely believe that there is an element of luck. I know you're probably tired of me hearing that word, but there is an element of luck. But of course, there also is, and that is the first thing, preparation, discipline, and hopefully some talent too, because you've got to figure out how to get to that point where you want to be. And if you are not prepared, organized, ready, when the day comes you're making 2 features at the same time, you're not going to be ready to do it because you don't know how to get there. You don't know how to structure and discipline and deliver, because it's very different when you go from a point where, well, this is $1,000 I raised of my money to make it a little short, to I'm now spending hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars of someone else's money that has to be made back because it's a business. It's not personal anymore. That's that transition. And so if you can't make that transition of discipline, no one else will ever give you another multi-million-dollar check to make a film ever again in your life. Won't happen.
Do you think a lot of indie filmmakers lack patience and they want to go from making a little short film to Avengers?
I think that sometimes there are stories of filmmakers and directors and writers who just seemingly come out of nowhere and suddenly they are the world's big hit. And I think a lot of us, myself included, will sometimes look at those people and go like, what did they, but you don't know the circumstances in which that person arrived. They might have been working for 10 years doing little things, and now suddenly this is their big moment, right? They might have had an uncle who is a studio head, or an aunt, or someone like, there are a lot of scenarios. And so I think that we sometimes look at those things and try to project, as is human nature, that thing on ourselves. We're like, that should be me. Like, I'm so much more talented than that person. But the way they got there is not the way you got there. Those are 2 different things. My journey is so much different than anybody else's, and so is anybody else's from mine. The thing about interviews like this, or anything that's about filmmaking, is it is subjective based on my experience. That does not mean it is the ultimate gospel on film. It's my experience.
Sure. Yours
might be different, and that's totally fine. So the reason we get impatient is because we're projecting what we think we should be ours based on the experiences that are not ours. So it's impossible, I think, for you to get anywhere if you're focused on X person is where I should be. It's a waste of your time. Be focused on what you do, because your voice is different than my voice, which is different than anyone else's. We all, if we've been working long enough, have figured out what we want to say, and what you say will always be different than what X person is doing because it's yours. So do that. Don't do them. They've done themselves. It's time for you to do you.
Any advice on developing a character?
To me, developing a character is a very collaborative process. So, if it's a script that you wrote, or if it's a script that was written for you, or you purchased, or whatever it is, there are other entities involved. It's not just about I'm the director and here's the character. It's about saying, here's what the writer wrote, if I did not write the script, and this is what the writer's intention is for that character within the arc of the story. Once I get involved, I usually have some notes. There's only 1 or 2 scripts I think I've ever read that I would say leave it as is. There's only one that I'm developing right now that I thought was perfect. Doesn't happen very often when you read a lot of scripts. But if you have those notes, it's then working with the writer to see how you want to steer the story. And for me, with theme being a huge thing, it's about thinking about characters within the context of theme. So now the writer and I have, come to something that we're satisfied with. It's not my job to be a dictator to the screenwriter. They're creative as well. So it's really about, again, meshing sensibilities, making sure that if the screenplay is one thing, I want to be something slightly different, conveying that to the writer in a way that's respectful of their work, but also finding something that you all agree on. Because I don't think it's good if you have a situation where the writer and the director both hate the thing they're working on, right? You want to keep everybody happy, as long as it's within the totality of what the vision should be. But that's one of the things you should decide before you say yes to a project. And then you're done with your notes, right? You've figured out what you want to modify. Then you're presenting it to actors who are going to have their own take entirely. And so if I'm going to start developing a character with the actor, it's now a new entity in its own right. This character that I have developed thematically on page with the writer is not necessarily going to be the same one that is portrayed on film with the actor, because they're going to bring their own experiences and ideas about what it means to perform that character, their motivations, their tics, their insecurities, their confidences. They bring that to the character, and sometimes that's different than what you intended. I find usually it's better. You just have to make sure as a director that whatever that character becomes with the actor and in collaboration with the actor is still in the intent of what you wrote and within the general character arc of the story, how that affects other characters when those choices are made, and how those as an ensemble create the entire theme that I want to deliver in the film.
That being said, do you think it's easier to work on your own or to have, quote, collaborators?
I think that it's always easier to work on your own, but it's never better. I think that, I'm so skeptical of anybody who says they're a writer, director, actor, producer, editor. They're not good at all those jobs. There's one or two they're good at. And I think that when people say they are multi-hyphenates of all of those things, they usually are not good at any of them. Be one or two things and be good at them. That will make your work better. And so I can live in isolation, and technically, could I direct, edit, produce, shoot? Technically I could. I know how to do all of those things, but I know what I'm best at. I'm a good director, I'm a good editor. And so I will sometimes do those two things. And even while I'm editing work I've directed, if I think that I'm not being disciplined enough, or if I'm not being judicious or I'm lost in the woods, I'll always bring in a second editor, because I can't be precious about it in my own work, because that looks poorly on me as a director, right? So you have to be cognizant of those things. So could you work on your own and do your own thing? Sure you can, but your work's going to suffer. I think most people that do that, their work does suffer. There are very few examples of people that are successful at that. I don't think most people can pull that off.
But in the middle, let's say, starting out, maybe they can't afford.
Yeah, oh yeah, when you're starting out, you have to, right? That's different, right? Like if you're starting out, sure, like when I first started out, I was producer, director, editor, all of those things. But if you want to make that transition to the middle best place, you can't do that anymore. You have to set that aside, and you have to start leaning in on and working with people who are professionals in those areas. I don't think you would go to, using the accountant example, a CPA who is also a chef, who is also an Uber driver. You would probably think that one of those things they may not be very good at. It's the same thing in film.
And maybe the need to hire out means that you are entering the middle.
Right. Well, it also, I think, shows that you're entering a different mindset, right? Because there are two kinds of filmmakers, I think. There's the professional filmmaker, which I'm lucky to be now. And then there's the ones that do it for themselves, who just kind of make it and they have their regular job and that's what they do. And that's totally fine. Neither one of those are bad or wrong. But if you're going to be a film professional, you've got to work with other people, because they are trained specifically in specialty areas that you are not. And if I'm trying to do all of those things, I'm invariably going to drop one of those balls or not do one of those things well, because I am not trained. I am not a lawyer who took the bar and passed it. I am not going to write my own contract because I took an entertainment law class in college. That does not make me a lawyer. That means that I might understand basic verbologies and structures, but I'm not going to have myself write my own contract with a company to direct a film because I know that. That doesn't make me good at it. That means I know something about it. I will hire the lawyer that's been trained in entertainment law, that passed the bar, that is practicing in multiple states to do my negotiations for me. It's the same thing with hiring a crew. Would you hire a lawyer? Do you want to do your own legal? I don't think so.
No.
I don't want to do that. I'm not trained in it. I'll screw me over in the end. Same thing will happen if you try to do everything yourself.
We asked you this question before, but I'm really great at repeating myself, so I'm going to ask it again.
Me too, I'm told. Yes.
So there's this quote at the end of your demo reel, and it says, and I quote, "As a filmmaker, you have this opportunity to make projects of quality, different films that mean something. That's what I look for."
Was something. That's actually, it's an old demo reel of mine. I totally had forgotten about that. That was one I had, I think, 5 or 6 years ago. I don't think my current one has it on it. And I just launched a new website, so I should know the answer to this. But no, I don't think that's on there. But the quote is still true. I did an interview with a magazine a few years ago, and that was a quote that I gave them. And what I mean by that, projects that mean something, is as vague as that sounds, to me it has deep purpose. I'm really interested in making films that say something about the human condition. I'm very interested in exploring people and ideas and exploring really what make people tick. It's the dramatic core of who we are as humans. For me, every film I make, I try to find in that core what I'm trying to express about human identity, about human loss, human processes, to give the audience that question mark when they are done watching the film, to observe something hopefully about themselves. I'm sure that must sound like a massive ego thing when I say that out loud. It's not that I know the answers to all of life's ills. I'm 31, still learning. But I am interested in using film as a medium to provoke a response from an audience to think about themselves in a different way, or to see the world in a different way, or to think about themselves in a different way. I think for me, so much of that is informed by growing up in a town of 123 people, living in Los Angeles, working around the world, that I think often of friends or family members, different people that have not had those opportunities to see things in a different way. I think when we live our lives in one place and that's all we do, or if we don't travel much, our world is this box. And I've been lucky enough to go outside of that box. And I want to bring some of those experiences from my own perspective back into the films that I make. Now, you may not agree with that perspective, whatever it may be, but that is my voice. That is what I gather from the totality of those experiences, and it's how I express myself on film. I always want the audience to walk away with a new idea or a thought process that makes them think, because I feel like if I haven't done that, then I haven't done my job as a director, and that's what something means to me.
You did a film recently, right, that is about sort of like white privilege versus a person of color and what their day is like.
Yes, every 9 hours, yes.
Can you talk about that? I saw part of the trailer.
Of course. I produced a film called Every 9 Hours with novelist Jim St. Germain. He wrote a book called A Stone of Hope. He was on President Obama's Council for Social Justice. He grew up in Haiti and then immigrated to Brooklyn to find out he was just as poor there as he was back home, and he wrote a memoir about these experiences, A Stone of Hope, which you can buy anywhere, books everywhere. Wonderful book. And I met him on a trip, ironically, to Tulsa, Oklahoma 2 years ago that the billionaire George Kaiser financed 50 of us from all over the country to come see the future of Tulsa. In fact, that was the reason that I got thought about for this documentary because I had been on that trip. And Jim and I met each other on that trip, and he had just published the book, and we stayed in touch. And he reached out to me last year and said, I wrote this short about race relations in America, and I really want you to produce it for me. And so I did, and it was a really, really great experience. He wanted the experience of making a short film before he makes a book adaptation of A Stone of Hope, which they're kind of preparing to make into a film. So he just wanted to go through that process and use his voice and his experiences to say something about race relations from his perspective of being a Black man, from being an immigrant, and really express what was on his mind. And he is, he's very, very eloquent. He and Jesse Eisenberg have been doing this tour across the country talking about race relations, and it's just remarkable. And so we did the film. We had Danny Trejo in it, some other folks. It was a wonderful shoot. We did it here in Los Angeles, in Culver City, and that will come out next month. I'm very excited to share it with you guys.
Can you give us any talking points about the film?
Yeah, it's so Jim co-directed it with Adam Margolis, who is an Emmy Award-winning director of television, and they co-directed together, and we shot it in 3 locations in Los Angeles. It's a very simple film. It's essentially one big dialogue about what happens to a man of mixed race when the police pulls him over for nothing specific, which I know to be true from many friends of mine of color, that is something that does happen in America, whether or not we like to admit it or not. And so it's about the repercussions of him explaining what happened to his white girlfriend. It was a really great script, and we had wonderful performers and a fantastic creative team to do it with. And it yet again expresses some of what I want to continue to do in my own career. Even though I am not a Black man, I am not of mixed race, that is not experience I have had. That does not mean that experience does not exist, because I have friends that have had this same experience. And so if I can use the skill sets that I've developed, and if I can listen to the stories that others have to say and be helpful in some way in telling that story, I want to be involved in that. And this is something I told Jim early on that I should not direct. It's not something I should direct because it is not an experience that I feel qualified to talk about. But it's something you should do because you have a voice. And you may not have done a film before, but I'll come produce it and I'll help guide you through the film part and the creative part so you can work with your experiences to tell the story that you know how to tell. You may not have ever directed something to know how to tell that story. You may need to learn some things, but you know how to tell that story and how to communicate what you want to communicate. And so it was really an honor for me to be involved in that capacity. I'm really proud of how it came out, so check it out soon.
Best advice anyone ever gave you on managing a film crew?
The best advice I think that anyone ever gave me, and this is true, that you fake it until you make it. If you don't know something on a set, you have to understand who you can talk to about it and who you cannot talk to about it. And again, this is part of being a director. It's about reading personalities and ideas, but that also applies to the work that you do. Now, luckily, in the middle where I am now, I've had enough experiences where that doesn't happen very often. But early on, when I'm a 19-year-old director, working with experienced actors, crew and such, you have to project a little bit because all these people know more than you do. I'm not suggesting you don't ask for help. There's two very, very different things, right? In fact, people, I think, respect you more when you tell them you don't know something versus pretending that you do, right? Because then they know you have a certain level of humility to say that, yeah, I need help with this thing. What I'm saying is that you need to understand who you can do that with and who you cannot do that with. Because there are sometimes people, especially starting out, that can be very toxic or damaging to you because of their own egos or issues that they have. You have to be a good enough read of people to understand that I can talk to this person about this thing that I don't know versus that other person who's going to start gossiping and saying this guy's an idiot or whoever it is. That's what you got to deal with and learn. And so you fake it in front of the people that you don't trust, and you ask the people that you do. And if you can't develop, you got to develop that level of discernment. And it's a skill that will honestly serve you well moving forward, because you'll do pitch meetings, you'll do money meetings, you'll do actor meetings. And for me, I'm very lucky to be particular about the choices that I make now. And when I say yes to things, it's because I've read all of those entities. It's because I've said, I like this financier, I don't think they're a crook. I like this producer, we're going to mesh well together. We have similar creative alignments. I want to cast this actor not just because they're talented, but because I know that we can work together. I'm not going to cast an asshole, even if they're the world's most talented actor, because it's going to be a waste of my time and energy. I got too many other things to deal with. I don't have time to deal with that. So figure out personalities and then fake it until you make it.
Tip-offs to personalities? How do you know when you're somewhere, the tension's high, because of time, money, that this is a person that I can actually ask a question to who's not going to make
I think it sounds so ethereal, but I think it has a lot to do with demeanor and body language. I think that's maybe something that I am better at most of the time. I sometimes get it wrong, but most of the time, because I specialize in that for a living, right? Directing's about if you're a dramatic director, not like an action director, right? It's more about language and motion and expression, not about like, here's the scene in the shot. It's a different kind of way of thinking about interpersonal relationships. And so I think that if you are more attuned to that, if you're more of a dramatic person, then I think it becomes easier to read that tone in what people say. Because what people say and what people say are two very, very different things. And so if those two are not congruent, usually that tells me a lot about a person, if I can trust them or not.
Yep. I've learned that the hard way too.
Yeah, it's like there are people that, what was it? Maya Angelou said that when people show you who they are the first time, believe them. That's true. It's one of the wisest pieces of writing I've ever read in my life, because if someone is what you see here and they're still that person when they're angry, when they're mad, whatever it is, you can trust them. If it's somebody whose body language says this, then their mouth says this, you usually are a snake and you should chop it off at the head immediately.
Yeah.
That's how you get through that. And so I learned that lesson, and that's how I try to discern.